What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we are taking one last look at the updated movement rules in the June 2024 rules update to Warhammer 40k. I have a video diving into all of the exact details of these movement rules that I released last week, but for those who don't know, 40k's movement rules were changed so that models can fit through tight spaces that allow room for their base, and the way that movement is measured is totally different now. Now models move in straight lines and can pay a set amount of movement to allow them to pivot during that movement. While for the most part this is just generally going to be very useful, especially for larger models that would have paid a lot of additional movement penalties in the past for rotating, it does introduce some weird edge cases, and that's what we're going to be trying to resolve in today's video. Now, while I think the premise of the video might be a little negative, I do want to preface this video by saying these rules are an incredibly beneficial change. Anything that reduces the minutiae and potential toxicity of the core rules, where models have to measure from a point on their base and measure the distance that that point moves, which allows for weird edge cases like circle bases paying to rotate around, or for larger models to have to pay movement for any tiny pivot that they would make, and allows players to either game the system by gaining additional unintended movement off of rotating and mismeasuring, or to angle shoot their opponents. These rules will do away with a lot of that, and I think the game is going to be faster and simpler to play, but I do think that there are some issues with these rules that affect certain unit types and that can be easily addressed. Part of this is going to be, I think, an interpretation of the rules that, in my opinion, was intended by the designers but was not explicitly stated, which will improve a lot of these rules quite a bit. I also would like to propose some rules changes that are made in the future that could clean up these mechanics and make them much better for a wider variety of unit types. To be clear, I'm going to be discussing the Pariah Nexus version of these rules. There were, for whatever reason, two versions included in the rules update. One of them in the core rules update, which were kind of a little bit more bare bones, and then an expanded version in the Pariah Nexus rules Tournament Companion. I don't like that there were two versions of the rules, because any sort of bifurcation of the community like that just sort of distorts the game and makes it more difficult for players to transition from format to format. The Pariah Nexus version also clears up some problems that I think the core rules version currently has, which I'll explain later. So let's first break down the problems with these mechanics. The first one is that round bases, and that is defined in the rules as bases that are circles, while ovals are technically a round shape, and many models in 40k have oval bases. In fact, it's going to be important for what we talk about later. The rules have defined round bases as being specifically circular. Models mounted on those bases do not pay for pivoting movement. Now, this sounds great. It means that your infantry and your small units that are on their tiny circle bases are not going to have to worry about rotating whatsoever, which is an incredibly positive change. The downside is that there are a lot of models that are mounted on round bases that do not use those bases for measurement. These are called hull measuring models, and they're even included in the rules. So as an example, let's take this Drukhari Raider. This is a vehicle mounted on a round base, and the rules commentary specifies that models mounted on bases like these use their hull for measurement. That means that any part of the model, so the miniature on top of the base and the base itself, is essentially treated as the base for the purposes of measuring to and from the raider. Typically, you'll use sort of a downward projection. You'll measure from the area of the table that they're hovering over. That's not technically correct, but it does clean up a lot of things, and that is how base contact and essentially engagement range is determined to models like this. However, if these models are allowed to pivot for free because they are mounted on a round base, you can, for example, let's say in this instance, and this is where a lot of these examples are going to come out of, this raider has deep struck next to the Space Marine Scouts. Now, we've used the TTS tools here to project a 9-inch bubble from the Space Marine Scout squad, so this is the distance at which the raider can set up from the scouts. As you can see, no part of that model, because you use the hull measurement rules, can set up within 9 inches of a scout, which we have done. However, if that raider wanted to charge these scouts to engage them or to take the objective that they're on, it could, at the beginning of its charge, pay 0 inches to pivot because it's on a round base, rotate itself like this, and suddenly its charge distance has been improved by close to 3 inches. Now, part of this is because of how the charge rules work. You have to roll enough movement on 2d6 for your charge roll to get your model within engagement range of an enemy. Now, because when a model deep strikes or sets up out of reserve, they always have to set up outside height of a certain distance. So in this case, it's 9 inches. So you're essentially 9.001 inches away from whatever you're setting up 9 inches away from, meaning that in order to get within an inch of them, you must roll at least a 9. However, as soon as we rotate and you break this barrier, your charge starts to get dramatically easier because now you no longer have to be 9 inches away, so you can start to move parts of your model into a position where they would get into engagement range of the enemy. So in this case, for example, you'd only have to roll a 6 because that would get within 1 inch of the scout squad with a charge move. So this is problematic because it allows these models to charge way faster out of reserve than they would normally be allowed to. Now, the funny thing about this issue is that this is not something that's new. Every edition of the game has had a problem with charge mechanics in reserve. They're basically just two entirely incompatible mechanics. On one end, you're trying to enforce specific distances to make charges out of reserve possible, but unlikely. However, that means that any idiosyncrasies with measurement allow units to get better charges, and because charges are graded on a curve, essentially, bonuses to charge make your charges essentially dramatically more likely. Rather than a more static progression where getting +1 on 1d6 just gives you, an additional 17% on your result, a charge move gets much better with a bonus on it. So, any time that you can fudge the measurement rules to get a bonus charge, it becomes really problematic. This was the case in 9th edition, again, with Drukhari Raiders. These guys tend to be kind of the poster child for problematic charge interactions because their model's so weird. It was discovered by players that because they hull measured, and hull measurement was always taken in straight lines from the base to the model itself, you could set up away from them 9 inches diagonally from the model, but because a charge is always measured across the tabletop and try to get you within an inch of the vertical elements of that model, you'd actually be closer than 9 inches moving horizontally. This was fixed in the rules commentary with a very complicated horizontal measurement rule, which required that models setting up out of reserve always measure the distance horizontally. They don't measure at diagonals to the models that they're setting up next to. This is different than every other type of measurement. It's always a little asterisk in the measurement rules for 40k. You always measure from hull measurements from any part of their base unless you're setting up out of reserve. In 8th edition, even, this was a problem too. Flying models could ignore vertical terrain when moving, especially when making charge moves. So you are allowed to set up 9 inches away from an enemy on top of a terrain feature, measuring again diagonally, and then roll a 4 or 5 inch charge to just hop down the terrain feature because you moved infinitely, essentially moving vertically when you flew, and then charge into the opponent, which again basically had to have a bunch of additional rules addendums added on to prevent that from happening. This is a perennial problem, but there is a very easy solution to this problem that fixes not only this issue, but also removes the necessity for all of these other rules addendums as well. And I'll talk about that momentarily. In addition, this vehicles mounted on round bases thing can also apply to models moving through tight spaces. We'll spawn some ruin walls for our Drukhari Raider friend here to demonstrate. This could allow this Raider, for example, to move through tight gaps as long as his base fits, ignoring the actual model, even though the model is used for measurement. So in this case, he could, for example, move like this, sort of phasing through these walls without having to use through the air movement. This isn't a big issue. This is not sort of a situation that comes up quite as often, but I do think that it is kind of unintended. So how do we solve these problems? And the first solution covers these issues with round-based vehicles. And I think, again, is the intention that the rules designers have that was not stated outright within the commentary at all. And it's a simple rules interpretation that I think I would be in favor of most events adopting. Essentially, if your model uses hull measurement, just treat the dimensions of the model as their base. So they no longer count as a round-based model for the purposes of determining their pivot value. They also can no longer move through those tight spaces as long as their hull is intersecting those ruin walls. They would have to find a space that's actually the size of the model itself. Again, the rules essentially treat a hull measuring model's hull as their base. There isn't really very much of a mechanical difference between those two, so I don't think that this is actually really that much of a rules change, but it does sort of counteract these potential abuses. Now, obviously, I don't think that it stops sort of all of these situations from arising. Even if a raider or a model that was similarly large had to pay 2 inches in order to pivot. That would mean that this cost 2 in order for them to rotate this way, and then they would be, you know, probably still a 6-inch charge from that. So they would have to roll an 8 to successfully charge rather than a 9. So they could get theoretically +1 to move out of reserve if you're using these rules, but it's significantly less abusive than the previous version, and it's also from gaining additional movement in other instances. Obviously, many of the models that hull measure in the game that are mounted on these round bases aren't very good in melee. They're mostly charging to, you know, take objectives and to tank shock people and things, but there are situations where you can use the free pivot as additional movement to get your model in range and just sort of fudge the movement mechanics of the game. And again, I don't think that's intended, and I think it's very easily rulinged away. Now, if we want to solve these problems more concretely, there are a couple of rules changes that I would like to see. Now, I prefer to reduce the amount of house ruling within the community as much as possible. I think that it becomes very difficult for players to transition between different communities if every community is using a slightly different version of the game because they've introduced a lot of their own house rules. So I don't really advocate for people implementing these rules themselves. What I would like to see is for the 40k design team to implement these in a Cool Rules update sometime in the near future. First of all, we just changed the charging rules, adding a section that says something along the lines of, when a unit sets up from reserve, the distance that must be rolled for a charge to be successful for that unit made that turn must be equal to or greater than the distance the unit was required to set up from the target of that charge. Essentially, if your unit has to set up 9 inches away from an enemy, they have to roll a 9-inch charge. That's it. If your opponent has an ability like Omni Scramblers that would push you back to setting up 12 inches away, you'd have to roll 12 inches to get them in charge range. Now, most of the time, that charge is impossible because you have to target enemies within 12 inches, but again, we get into sort of diagonal measurement territory, and in some instances, it might be possible, but only if you roll boxcars. Now, speaking of that diagonal measurement, a rules change like this would also remove the requirement for those horizontal measurement rules to be applied. It's unnecessary if you just specify that those models have to roll 9 inches or whatever the setup distance is in order to get to grips. But this also allows models with improved reinforcement setup, so like Chaos Demons, for example, it still allows them to roll 6-inch charges if they need to. You're not specifying that you have to roll a 9-inch charge if you're setting out of Deep Strike, because that would obviously invalidate a ton of reinforcement abilities in the game. There are some instances where models can move after setting up. In most cases, those models can't charge after that, but there are some incredible corner cases where you might be able to move closer before the charge phase occurs. In those cases, it's such a corner case that I think it's okay that those instances are still impacted by a rule like this. Now, the other problem I have with these rules are mounted models. As I mentioned in my previous video about these, mounted models tend to be very small, and according to the Pariah Nexus rules, because they're on oval bases, not circles, still must pay 2 inches for rotation. So we have like a Primaris Outrider here, for example, I think are more heavily impacted than was probably intended by these pivot rules. Anytime you need to make a move that rotates your model slightly, that would cost you 2 inches, and because their bases are so annoyingly sized, they tend to have to do those rotations most of the time when they're moving. This also applies to things like pile in and consolidate moves. So your pivot cost applies literally anytime you move. So if you're trying to pile in and consolidate these guys and they have to rotate to get themselves closer to an opponent, that costs you 2 inches of movement, which is a lot. 2 out of 3 is a big deal. I would like to see models like this reduced to a 1-inch pivot value. Now, the Primaris Outrider here is not measuring exactly right on the tabletop simulator model. It's a little messed up. As you can see, it's pivoting from kind of the center of his bicycle, I guess, not the center of his base, which is not technically correct, but I think it's just looking at the middle of the model's volume. However, even then, even though the model's pivoting way more than it should be, it doesn't actually gain more than 1 inch of distance when pivoting. So you would still have to pay some amount of movement for models even on the large Outrider base when you are pivoting your model. And it makes them much more maneuverable in place of costing you 2 inches of movement without gaining you any additional distance. Obviously, the problem becomes if you bring this guy out of reserve and you allow him to pay 0 inches for a pivot, he can very easily pivot within 9 inches of an enemy and get himself essentially a charge bonus. Which is why we have to be very careful about ensuring that none of these models get closer to their target than is intended. However, right now, in order to make this pivot, he would actually be increasing his charge distance because he has to pay that full 2 inches. Now, the 1-inch pivot value for mounted models does seem good, except when you start to consider models like Randmasters and Logan Grimnir on Storm Rider are also mounted models, and giving those models a 1-inch pivot value would be broken. If this guy was able to sit up, right next to the Space Marines, and then pivot 1 inch and then improve his charge distance significantly, then suddenly he gets super scary, especially because he's also a Chaos Demon, so a lot of times he's doing a 6-inch deep strike anyway, so he starts to get 5-inch deep strikes, and it gets very degenerate very quickly. So I'd like to see a change to the pivot rules that makes non-vehicle or monster units that are mounted on a non-round base, so an oval that is less than 120 millimeters long at its greatest dimension, get a 1-inch pivot. So models mounted on these larger bases would still have to pay 2 inches for pivot, just like they do currently, but smaller models on the little tiny bases, whether you're a beast, whether you're mounted, whether you're a weird infantry, like you have Rain, I guess, would only have to pay 1 inch for pivoting. That prevents you from being able to abuse them in order to get easy deep strikes or additional movement, but it also makes them way easier to maneuver on the table, which is appropriate for models that are meant to be the most maneuverable models on the battlefield. Were all these changes to be implemented, I think these new pivot rules would be really nice. Right now, they are just very nice, and to be fair, most of the downsides to them that I've proposed in this video are relatively corner case. Getting yourself bonus charges on things like Drukhari Raiders doesn't matter too often, it's just annoying and gamey when it does. And heading those situations off at the pass, I think, is just beneficial for the game. I do really like these mechanics. I do think that they just need a little bit of ironing out to be fairer to more unit types, but in my game so far, they've been an absolute dream. It makes large round-based models so much easier to play, and it also makes measuring for oval-based models or hull measurement models way less stupid. While I don't have too many games with the updated rules under my belt, it's probably saved me 5 to 10 minutes over the course of a game, just not having to measure the distance traveled by a weirdly shaped irregular vehicle or an oval-based monster, for example. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about these rules and my proposed changes to them. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.